On the frozen night of February 16th to 17th, 1944, thousands of German soldiers, including foreign volunteers from across Europe who had joined Hitler's crusade against communism, charged across the icy Gniloy Tikich River under withering Soviet fire. The river valley became a killing ground, strewn with bodies and abandoned armor, as approximately 56,000 encircled troops attempted a desperate breakout from what would be called the Little Stalingrad. Among them was the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, an elite unit that would be shattered in a single night of blood and ice. Copenhagen, 1941. You're 20 years old, staring at a recruitment poster. Bold letters promise you a place in history, not as a conquered subject, as a defender of European civilization against the Bolshevik hordes threatening to sweep westward. The 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking is calling. They want Danes, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians, Finns, volunteers to join what Nazi propaganda painted as a multinational crusade to save the West. Thousands answered that call. By 1944, Wiking had become the poster child for Hitler's vision of a pan-European SS, a supposedly elite force of ideologically unified warriors bound by their hatred of communism. But here's where the myth collides with reality. Despite its reputation as overwhelmingly foreign, volunteers from occupied countries comprised less than 20% of the division's total strength. The vast majority were German personnel. This wasn't the multinational Legion of Propaganda. It was a German SS division with foreign window dressing. And those foreign volunteers? Their motivations were far messier than Nazi recruiters admitted. Some, like Danish officer Knud Børge Martensen, were genuine anti-communist ideologues who believed they were defending Western civilization. Others were opportunists seeking adventure, steady pay, or escape from occupied territories with limited prospects. Post-war testimonies and wartime letters reveal a division plagued by cultural tensions. Language barriers created confusion during combat. Morale problems festered. Desertion rates among some national contingents ran high. Martensen himself would later write about the isolation and creeping doubt that haunted foreign volunteers as they watched their comrades die in a war that increasingly felt like Germany's alone. The promise was elite status, the best equipment, the most critical missions. Reality delivered something different. By early 1944, Wiking found itself stretched dangerously thin along the collapsing Eastern Front. The division was tasked with holding critical river crossings near Cherkassy and Korsun in Ukraine. They occupied an exposed salient, a bulge in German lines that jutted vulnerably into Soviet-controlled territory. Marshal Ivan Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front and General Nikolai Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front were closing in. They were preparing a double envelopment that would trap approximately 56,000 German troops, including Wiking, in what would become known as the Korsun-Cherkassy pocket. The European crusade was about to become a frozen tomb. Look at a map of the Eastern Front in January 1944. One feature jumps out immediately: a dangerous bulge jutting into Soviet-controlled territory near the Ukrainian towns of Korsun and Cherkassy. This wasn't just poor positioning. It was a strategic disaster waiting to happen. German Army Group South had been stretched dangerously thin across Ukraine. Soviet winter offensives had hammered them relentlessly. The Red Army's successful crossing of the Dnieper River had shattered German defensive lines. The same Wiking division that had been promised glory as defenders of European civilization now faced an impossible mission: holding critical river crossings along the Dnieper and Gniloy Tikich rivers, with extended defensive lines that left entire sectors vulnerable. The salient was a textbook example of military overextension. Approximately 56,000 German troops occupied these positions. 11th Army Corps, Wiking, 6 infantry divisions, elements of the 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions. Any competent staff officer could see they were ripe for encirclement. Soviet planners saw it too. Marshal Ivan Konev commanded the 2nd Ukrainian Front. General Gniloy Tikich led the First Ukrainian Front. Together, they began coordinating what would become a masterclass in operational warfare, a massive double envelopment designed to trap the entire German force in a pocket. This wasn't improvised. It was methodical, calculated, backed by sophisticated intelligence gathering that the Germans fatally underestimated. Soviet reconnaissance flights mapped German positions with precision. Radio intercept stations captured and decoded Wehrmacht communications. They revealed unit strengths, supply status, defensive weaknesses. Local partisan networks provided real-time intelligence on German movements. The Soviets knew exactly where Wiking was positioned. They knew how many operational tanks it had, approximately 40 to 50, mostly Panzer IVs with some Panthers. Most critically, they understood the logistical fragility of the entire salient. By late January, the pieces were moving into position. Konev's Second Ukrainian Front deployed south of the Bulge. The 4th Guards Army, the 5th Guards Tank Army, the 52nd Army. Vatutin's First Ukrainian Front moved to the north, the 6th Tank Army, the 27th Army. The jaws of a steel trap were opening. German commanders inside the salient were about to realize they'd walked into a carefully prepared killing ground. The first reports came in piecemeal, fragmentary radio transmissions from panicked forward units, Soviet tanks where there shouldn't be any Soviet tanks. Then the trickle became a flood. By the evening of January 28, 1944, German commanders inside the pocket faced a terrifying reality. Marshal Ivan Konev's Second Ukrainian Front and General Gniloy Tikich's First Ukrainian Front had executed their double envelopment with devastating precision. Soviet forces had sliced through weakened German positions. They now formed an iron ring around approximately 56,000 trapped men. The 4th Guards Army, the 5th Guards Cavalry Corps, the 52nd Army, the 5th Guards Tank Army, the 6th Tank Army, the 27th Army, all converging. Inside that ring, the entire 11th Army Corps under General Wilhelm Stemmermann, the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, the 72nd, 88th, 389th, 57th, and 167th Infantry Divisions, scattered elements of the 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions. Artillery positions had been overrun, supply columns ambushed, roads severed by Soviet armor moving with shocking speed to seal every escape route. But here's what's crucial to understand about the German response in those first critical days. Denial. SS Brigade Führer Herbert Gille commanded Wiking. General Stemmermann commanded the entire trapped force. Both men genuinely believed they could hold a defensive perimeter until relief forces arrived. This wasn't irrational optimism. It was based on recent history. The Demyansk pocket in 1942 had been supplied by air and eventually relieved. Surely the same could happen here. Soviet commanders knew better. While German officers studied maps and calculated how long their ammunition might last, Soviet forces were already deploying artillery batteries, positioning armor at every potential breakout point. Intercepted German radio transmissions revealed exact defensive positions and supply status. Soviet intelligence had been reading German communications throughout the operation. The Soviets weren't just containing the pocket, they were methodically preparing to crush it. By early February, reality began setting in for the men trapped inside. Luftwaffe supply drops were failing. Soviet air superiority and brutal winter weather meant most desperately needed supplies never reached their intended targets. Fuel stocks dwindled. Food rations shrank. The pocket was shrinking too. Soviet assaults compressed the perimeter day by day. Relief was uncertain at best. And with each passing day, the frozen Ukrainian steppe was transforming from a temporary defensive position into something far more sinister. A prison where 56,000 men would face starvation, frostbite, and the growing certainty of annihilation. Inside a cramped command bunker lit by flickering candlelight, 2 men hunched over a mud-stained map of the Korsun pocket. SS Brigade Führer Herbert Gille, commander of the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, traced a finger along possible escape routes. General Wilhelm Stemmermann bore ultimate responsibility for all 56,000 trapped men of the 11th Army Corps. He tallied numbers that grew grimmer by the hour. Fuel for perhaps 40 operational tanks. Food rations reduced to starvation levels. Ammunition stocks that couldn't sustain another major Soviet assault. Every calculation led to the same unavoidable conclusion. They were running out of time. Every decision they made would determine whether thousands of men lived or died. Gniloy had built his reputation on tactical brilliance, the kind of commander who could read a battlefield and exploit weaknesses others missed. But tactical genius meant nothing when you had no fuel to maneuver your panzers, no ammunition to sustain a defense. He coordinated constantly with the other trapped division commanders, trying to maintain some semblance of combat effectiveness while Soviet artillery methodically compressed their perimeter. His division, once considered elite, was being systematically strangled. Stemmermann faced an even more impossible burden. Archival records reveal a man torn between conflicting imperatives. Orders from Army Group South Command insisted they hold their positions, wait for relief forces that might never arrive. But his own correspondence documents mounting internal doubts about whether relief was even feasible. Radio intercepts showed the Soviets were reinforcing the ring around them faster than German relief columns could advance. Should they conserve their remaining fuel and ammunition for defense? Or gamble everything on an immediate breakout while they still had the strength to fight? The tension between the two commanders crystallized around one brutal question. When? Break out too early, and they'd abandon wounded men and equipment that might yet be saved by relief forces. Wait too long, and they'd be too weak to break through at all. Stemmermann's messages to higher command grew increasingly desperate, seeking permission for action even as he watched his corps being methodically destroyed. His final message would cut through all the strategic ambiguity with 3 words that captured their desperation: breakout, at all costs. While Gniloy and Stemmermann wrestled with impossible choices inside the pocket, the men orchestrating their destruction operated with absolute clarity of purpose. Marshal Ivan Konev and General Nikolai Vatutin weren't just trying to destroy another German corps. They were determined to make Korsun-Cherkassy an unmistakable demonstration of Soviet operational superiority, a turning point that would accelerate the liberation of Ukraine. Proof that the Red Army had mastered the art of encirclement that had once devastated their own forces. But their intelligence reports painted a sobering picture. The trapped force included the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, elite troops with combat experience stretching back to 1941, 6 battle-hardened infantry divisions, elements of 2 panzer divisions, approximately 56,000 men who wouldn't surrender without a fight. Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front and Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front had executed the double envelopment brilliantly. They deployed the 4th Guards Army, 5th Guards Cavalry Corps, 5th Guards Tank Army, and 6th Tank Army to seal the pocket. But sealing it was one thing. Keeping it sealed against a coordinated breakout attempt was another. Soviet command documents reveal something the triumphant post-war narratives often omit: genuine anxiety. Heated debates erupted over reserve allocation. Which escape routes needed reinforcement? Could they maintain the encirclement if German relief forces broke through from the outside while trapped units attacked from within? The operation was far from a foregone conclusion. This was February 1944, not 1941. Soviet operational coordination had evolved dramatically since the war's catastrophic early years. Konev and Vatutin demonstrated unprecedented cooperation between 2 separate front commands, sharing intelligence from intercepted German radio transmissions, coordinating artillery strikes to maximum effect. They understood the strategic prize. Destroying Army Group South's combat power here would open the road to Western Ukraine and beyond. Korsun-Cherkassy had to be more than a tactical victory. It had to be a killing ground that would shatter German offensive capability in the south forever. But achieving that goal would cost them dearly. Soviet forces would ultimately suffer an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 casualties, containing the pocket and repelling breakout attempts. The intensity of German resistance, desperate men fighting for survival, would test Soviet resolve at every turn. As artillery bombardments pounded German positions day and night, and February's brutal cold settled over the battlefield, the Soviets tightened their grip. Inside the pocket, the encircled troops now faced an enemy more implacable than Soviet tanks, the logistical death spiral that would determine their fate. Soldiers craned their necks skyward at the sound of engines. Junkers. Ju-52 transports, lumbering through the gray February sky. For the encircled men of Wiking and 11th Army Corps, these planes represented their only lifeline. But as parachutes blossomed and supply containers tumbled earthward, the desperate hope turned to horror. Soviet fighters tore through the formations. What few containers made it through drifted on winter winds into Soviet-controlled territory. Others slammed into the frozen ground, splitting open and scattering their precious contents across the snow. Crates of ammunition shattered. Medical supplies buried in drifts. Food trampled into the ice. This was the brutal mathematics of encirclement. Once the Soviet trap closed on January 28, 1944, resupply could only be attempted by air. But Soviet air superiority and Ukraine's notoriously poor winter weather turned the Luftwaffe's efforts into a cruel lottery. Most supply drops fell catastrophically short of requirements. Many never reached German lines at all. The shortages documented in field reports paint a picture of systematic strangulation. Fuel became so scarce that Wiking's approximately 40 to 50 operational tanks sat immobile within days. Mostly Panzer IV AOSF, H and J models, a handful of Panthers, some Stu G3s, all reduced to stationary pillboxes as their crews watched their fuel gauges drop to empty. Food rations plummeted to starvation levels. Men who'd once received adequate field rations now survived on scraps, their bodies weakening from malnutrition, even as the fighting intensified. Medical supplies ran out as casualties mounted. Doctors were forced to operate without anesthesia. Reuse bandages. Communications equipment failed or was destroyed by Soviet artillery. Radio sets fell silent. Field telephone lines were cut. Entire units simply vanished from the command network. Gniloy and Stemmermann lost contact with battalions, unable to coordinate defense or organize relief. The cold became an enemy as implacable as the Red Army. February temperatures plunged well below freezing. Without fuel for fires or vehicles, frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Soldiers huddled in frozen trenches, watching their equipment fail around them. Tank engines that wouldn't start, weapons that jammed, vehicles abandoned where they stood for lack of fuel or spare parts. This wasn't defeat by enemy action alone. This was an army being strangled, its combat effectiveness bleeding away with every passing day as the pocket tightened and the skies remained empty of relief. Inside a frozen foxhole on February 10, 1944, SS Untersturmführer Karl-Heinz Boska scratched a few lines into his diary by the light of a guttering candle stub. "We use the frozen bodies of our comrades as windbreaks," he wrote, his handwriting barely legible. "The hunger gnaws constantly. At night, we whisper about home. Will we ever see it again?" These weren't the words of a fanatical ideologue. They were the desperate confession of a man watching his world collapse, one frozen hour at a time. The daily reality inside the Korsun pocket bore no resemblance to the propaganda image of elite SS warriors. Danish volunteer Knud Børge Martenson's letters home, never delivered, described men reduced to scavenging horsemeat from dead animals, boiling leather belts for something, anything, to fill their stomachs. The extreme cold claimed as many casualties as Soviet shells. Soldiers with frostbitten fingers couldn't pull triggers. Men with frozen feet couldn't march. The camaraderie that supposedly defined Wiking began fracturing under the weight of impossible suffering. For the foreign volunteers especially, the pocket became a crucible of doubt. These men had joined believing they were defending Western civilization against Bolshevism. Now they huddled in frozen trenches, isolated by language barriers and cultural tensions, even from their German comrades. As casualties mounted, some questioned whether their commitment had been worth it. Wiking would ultimately lose around 1,000 killed and thousands more wounded from its roughly 15,000-man strength. The myth of fanatical unity dissolved in the face of starvation and abandonment. The suffering wasn't distributed equally. German officers like Herbert Gniloy faced crushing pressure to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete intelligence and dwindling resources. Foreign volunteers wrestled with existential questions about loyalty and purpose. But the rank-and-file soldiers, German and foreign alike, suffered most acutely. Many felt abandoned as they watched the February sky remain empty of relief forces, forced to endure conditions that pushed human endurance beyond its limits. Desperation bred improvisation. Viking engineers began cannibalizing destroyed vehicles, building makeshift rafts and sleds to move the mounting numbers of wounded. Soldiers scavenged, captured Soviet anti-tank guns and rifles when their own ammunition ran out. Officers who'd once commanded Panthers and Panzer IVs now led men armed with whatever they could carry. And slowly, terribly, the realization set in. No relief was coming. The only way out was through Soviet lines, across a frozen river, into the guns waiting on the other side. On the horizon, German soldiers watched the distant flashes, artillery and tank fire lighting up the winter darkness like a deadly thunderstorm. Relief forces were out there. Panzer divisions from 3rd Panzer Corps fighting desperately to break through Soviet lines and reach the pocket. Men strained their eyes toward those flashes, calculating distances, whispering prayers. Then, night after night, the terrible silence. The flashes grew fainter, pushed back by Soviet counterattacks. And finally, they disappeared altogether. The relief forces had failed. Outside the pocket, German armored units, including the 1st, 16th, and 17th Panzer Divisions, launched multiple attempts to punch through Soviet defenses in early February 1944. They came within 15 kilometers of the encircled troops, close enough that the trapped men could hear the distant rumble of their guns. But Marshal Konev had anticipated this, deploying fresh reserves and anti-tank positions that turned each relief attempt into a bloodbath. The panzers were beaten back, their tanks burning in the snow, their infantry pinned down by artillery fire that never seemed to stop. Inside the pocket, Herbert Gniloy and Wilhelm Stemmermann faced an impossible choice. Archival correspondence between the two commanders documents their growing desperation and fundamental disagreement. Stemmermann wanted to wait. Surely another relief attempt would succeed. Surely the Luftwaffe would increase supply drops. Surely holding out a few more days would bring salvation. Gniloy, watching his division disintegrate from starvation and cold, argued for immediate breakout while they still possessed some combat capability. Every day they waited, fuel reserves dwindled further. Ammunition stocks shrank. More men died from wounds that could have been treated in proper hospitals. By mid-February, the question had answered itself. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Artillery batteries were rationing shells, counting rounds for a final barrage. Fuel was gone. Those 40 operational tanks Wiking had started with now sat as frozen monuments, stripped for parts. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Field hospitals packed with wounded who screamed through the night while surgeons operated by candlelight without proper anesthesia. And Soviet pressure intensified daily. Probing attacks testing German lines, tightening the noose. On February 16, 1944, Stemmermann sent his final message: breakout at all costs that night. Orders passed down through frozen, exhausted units. Abandon all vehicles. Abandon heavy weapons. Take only what you can carry: rifle, ammunition, 1 day's rations if you have them. Form up in assault columns. During the night of February 16th to 17th, we charged through Soviet lines toward the Gniloy Tikich River. There's a German bridgehead on the far side. Get there or die trying. In the early hours of February 17th, 1944, signal flares arced into the black winter sky above the Korsun-Cherkassy pocket. All along the German perimeter, thousands of exhausted men rose from frozen foxholes and began moving toward the Gniloy Tikich River. They carried only rifles and whatever ammunition they could scavenge. Behind them lay every tank, every artillery piece, every vehicle, abandoned in the snow for lack of fuel. Ahead lay 3 miles of open ground and a frozen river valley where Soviet forces waited in prepared positions. The moment the first German columns emerged from the tree line, Soviet artillery opened fire. Katyusha rockets screamed overhead. Tracers from machine gun positions stitched red lines across the snow. Within minutes, the pristine white landscape transformed into a killing field. Men fell in waves. The snow turned red. SS Brigade Führer Herbert Gille, already wounded but refusing evacuation, led elements of Wiking forward. Beside him, General Wilhelm Stemmermann directed the 11th Army Corps in its final, desperate assault. Survivors would later describe the terror of that charge. Thousands of men running, stumbling, crawling through knee-deep snow, while Soviet tanks emerged from concealed positions along the riverbank, firing directly into the massed formations. The Gniloy Tikich River Valley became a slaughterhouse. Those who reached the river found it partially frozen, partially flowing with icy water. Men waded through chest-deep currents, dragging wounded comrades, abandoning those too injured to move. Soviet tanks pursued them to the water's edge. Soviet accounts describe tank crews charging into German lines at enormous risk, attempting to block escape corridors. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted atop disabled vehicles. The emotional toll on Soviet soldiers witnessing such carnage was profound. One guardsman later wrote that the river valley was strewn with bodies as far as the eye could see. General Stemmermann was killed directing the assault, cut down by Soviet fire while trying to organize his disintegrating corps. Gille, bleeding and barely conscious, continued leading survivors across the river. Of the approximately 20,000 German soldiers killed during the entire Korsun-Cherkassy operation, many died in that river valley during the final breakout. Another 18,000 were captured, most of them wounded men left behind in overwhelmed field hospitals. The Wiking division lost approximately 1,000 killed and up to 2,000 missing. Its combat strength reduced by more than half in a single night. As dawn broke on February 17th, the river valley revealed its full horror, a frozen tableau of corpses, abandoned equipment, and scattered survivors stumbling westward through the snow. Exhausted survivors staggered into German lines. Officers began the grim task of counting who remained. Units that had marched into the pocket with thousands of men now mustered in the hundreds. Company commanders called out names to scattered groups of hollow-eyed soldiers, desperately searching for their men among the exhausted refugees stumbling through the snow. The accounting, when it finally came together, revealed the full scale of catastrophe. Of approximately 56,000 German troops trapped in the Korsun-Cherkassy pocket, the operation had cost roughly 20,000 killed. Another 10,000 wounded had made it out, but would never fight again. Perhaps most devastating were the 18,000 captured. The majority wounded men left behind in overwhelmed field hospitals when the breakout began, now prisoners facing an uncertain fate in Soviet captivity. For the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, the elite formation that had once been Hitler's showcase of pan-European anti-communist unity, the numbers told a story of complete destruction. The division suffered approximately 1,000 killed, several thousand wounded, up to 2,000 missing or captured. Its combat strength had been reduced by 40 to 60% in a single night. But the casualty figures alone didn't capture the full devastation. Every single piece of heavy equipment had been abandoned in the pocket. The approximately 40 to 50 tanks Wiking had fielded at the start, Panzer IVs, Panthers, Stu G3s, now sat silent in the snow, out of fuel or broken down, left as trophies for Soviet forces. Every artillery piece, every transport vehicle, every supply truck, all gone. The division that staggered back to German lines was essentially an infantry force, stripped of the armor and firepower that had made it effective. Even Soviet victory had come at terrible cost. Soviet forces suffered an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 casualties, containing and crushing the Breakout, testament to the desperation and ferocity of German resistance. The frozen earth around Korsun-Cherkassy had consumed soldiers from both sides with equal brutality, a reminder that on the Eastern Front, even winning could feel like losing. But as German commanders tallied their losses and tried to rebuild shattered units, larger questions loomed. What did this disaster mean for the war itself? For the foreign volunteers who survived, what did it mean to have sacrificed so much for a cause now clearly losing? And for the nations that had sent their sons to fight in Hitler's crusade, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, how would they reckon with this blood debt when the war finally ended? They came back hollow-eyed and frostbitten. Thousands of survivors staggering into German lines with the haunted look of men who had seen something beyond comprehension in that frozen river valley. The 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking was pulled back to refit. But everyone knew the truth. This elite division would never recover. Of the foreign volunteers who survived, many faced a crisis of faith that no amount of anti-communist ideology could answer. The river crossing had stripped away the romantic veneer of their crusade, leaving only corpses in the snow and the terrible question, had any of it been worth the price? But there were other victims whose suffering appears in no official casualty count. Local Ukrainian civilians caught in the encirclement endured looting, displacement, and violence from both sides. German troops desperate for food ransacked villages. Soviet forces, viewing locals as potential collaborators, showed little mercy. These civilians represent the forgotten human cost beyond the combatants. Families torn apart, homes destroyed, lives shattered in the crossfire of ideological warfare. Among the survivors was Danish officer Knud Børge Martensen. His last-ditch counterattack with a handful of volunteers had bought precious time for hundreds to escape. He survived the river crossing, but liberation would bring its own reckoning. In post-war Denmark, service in the Waffen-SS meant trials, imprisonment, social ostracism. Martensen's story embodied the impossible position of foreign volunteers, celebrated as heroes by their SS comrades, condemned as traitors by their countrymen. The Soviet perspective reveals its own complexities. Guardsman Ivan Petrov's account describes not triumphant victory, but the emotional toll of witnessing the carnage. The river valley strewn with bodies. The screams of wounded men freezing in the darkness. Soviet soldiers had their own nightmares about Korsun-Cherkassy, their own questions about the human cost of stopping the German breakout. These accounts humanize the Soviet experience beyond propaganda, showing soldiers grappling with the moral weight of total war. For the civilians, there would be no medals, no memoirs, no recognition. They simply tried to survive, caught between armies that viewed them as either resources to exploit or obstacles to eliminate. Their displacement, their losses, their trauma. These became footnotes in a military history obsessed with tactical maneuvers and casualty counts. The survivors carried Korsun-Cherkassy with them forever, in frostbitten limbs that never healed properly, in nightmares that replayed the river crossing, in the knowledge that they had witnessed something that would be remembered, forgotten, and weaponized differently across a divided post-war Europe. How that memory was shaped depended entirely on where the survivors returned. In Russia and Ukraine, the battle became Korsun-Cherkassy, a celebrated liberation victory marked by monuments and annual commemorations, proof that Soviet forces had mastered the operational art of encirclement. For Moscow, this was vindication. Approximately 56,000 German troops trapped, 20,000 killed, 18,000 captured. A tactical demonstration that the Red Army could now execute the same devastating double envelopments that had once threatened their own survival at Kiev and Vyazma. The battle reinforced patriotic narratives about the Great Patriotic War. It marked a turning point in reclaiming Ukrainian territory from fascist occupation. In Western Europe, the story was silence and shame. Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway, the nations whose young men had volunteered for Wiking, faced uncomfortable reckonings. Post-war governments condemned the volunteers as collaborators and traitors, leading to trials, imprisonment, social ostracism that would last decades. Danish officer Knud Børge Martensen, who had led that desperate counterattack, buying time for hundreds to escape, returned home to face prosecution. The experience was suppressed in national memory, a dark chapter that contradicted post-war narratives of resistance and liberation. In Germany itself, Korsun-Cherkassy became part of the tragic Eastern Front narrative, acknowledged but rarely commemorated. The Waffen-SS's divisive legacy, its documented association with war crimes and collaboration with genocide, made public remembrance impossible. The myth of Wiking as elite warriors, defenders of European civilization against Bolshevism, collapsed under the weight of evidence. Tactical performance could not erase moral culpability. The division's destruction in that frozen pocket revealed the hollowness of SS mythology. Contemporary military scholarship draws uncomfortable comparisons. Stalingrad had trapped over 300,000 German troops in a months-long siege that became synonymous with total annihilation. Korsun-Cherkassy was smaller, 56,000 encircled versus 300,000, but tactically similar. It demonstrated that by 1944, Soviet forces had perfected the operational art that would carry them to Berlin. The partial breakout at Korsun, unlike Stalingrad's total surrender, offered no comfort. The human cost was proportionally just as devastating. The material losses just as catastrophic. Today, the Gniloy Tikich River Valley is peaceful farmland. Few markers commemorate what happened on that February night in 1944. Crops grow where thousands died in icy water, fighting for a cause that had already lost, in a war that would consume millions more before its end. The silence is almost complete, except for the questions that linger about what men will endure, what they will believe, when ideology collides with the brutal mathematics of modern war. The Korsun-Cherkassy pocket stands as a brutal demonstration of how the Eastern Front had evolved by 1944. Soviet operational superiority had surpassed German tactical excellence. No amount of ideological conviction could compensate for strategic overextension and logistical collapse. The river valley at Gniloy Tikich, where thousands died in a single desperate night, became a monument to the horrific human cost of ideological warfare. A frozen hell where the myth of SS invincibility drowned in icy water alongside the bodies of true believers from across Europe. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.